Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is actually going to be about the 6.5 midfielders. And the reason why I wanted to do this video is because I actually think it's one of the most lucrative positions in FPL this season, so specifically when we look at game week 1. What I like about the position so much is we have a lot of flexibility, and there are some great hop-on, hop-off points as well. You also have some options that actually have a great run of fixtures, so you don't really have any fears about, having to actually jump off and switch to another position at a different price point. The beauty here now, in my opinion, is that you can actually move to options like a Barnes, like an Almiron, and even a Diaby. Some new joiners in the Premier League will actually be exciting FPL options. As far as game week 1, though, I do think the absolute best option to start off with is going to be Bryan Mbeumo. For me, the reason why Mbeumo is so much better than the other options is he is, first of all, a penalty taker, something that he does share in common with someone like Eze, but the Brentford team have been a comfortably better attack than a team like, let's say, Crystal Palace. So I do think that there is a level of difference between, rating a team like a Brighton or a Brentford, who are both top 10, top half offenses, compared to, let's say, Crystal Palace, who are significantly weaker from that aspect. Yes, of course, Tony will be leaving this team, but a lot of people are rating Wissa as a great option. I don't see the reason to sort of neglect Bryan Mbeumo. Yes, of course, he's going to play on the wing position, but look, someone like Mitoma is going to be a fantastic option, and we're not discrediting him as a pick just because he's a winger. I think wingers have done perfectly well in FPL. A lot of people have been looking at total points as well. Very unfair to someone like Mbeumo, who was actually playing as a forward last year, so he didn't get the benefit of getting extra points for a goal and then also extra points for a clean sheet. And we know this Brentford team are actually a very, very solid defense, plus have actually, in my opinion, the best fixtures from game week 1 to game week 10. So even if you, let's say, wanted to take a little bit more of a short-term approach, right, like game week 1 to 6, game week 1 to 8, I still think Brentford actually have better fixtures than a Brighton and even a Crystal Palace. So that's why I think Mbeumo is an interesting option. And when you look at the underlying stats, both expected goals, expected assists, and even the actual output from Mbeumo has been very consistent. It's matched Mitoma pretty much in stats. And then in terms of actual output, he's actually slightly better. So if you're expecting him to sort of stay at the same consistent level, and if you look at his numbers with and without Tony, they're both very positive. In fact, his numbers actually improve when Tony's out of the team. So the additional thing for Mbeumo that really is that sort of icing on the cake is the fact that I think he will 100% take penalties. The last time we actually saw Wissa and Mbeumo take a penalty for Brentford, or when they were on the pitch, was actually when Mbeumo took the penalty versus Nottingham Forest, and he scored that goal. So far in his career, he's only taken 3 penalties, scored 3, but that's already a good enough sign where when you see Wissa was on the pitch, and Mbeumo took the penalty last time out last season, I can't really see a reason why Mbeumo would start this season without penalties. So that's a huge plus for Mbeumo for me. As far as moving to the second best midfielder, I think it's actually by far Kaoru Mitoma. And the reason why isn't because he did so well last season, but simply because the underlying stats are really positive. He's actually a very creative player, which we've seen. In terms of the dribbling aspect, of course, everyone loves it. But just in terms of actually getting goals, he's been in fantastic positions. The expected goal per 90 is really, really good. And another thing to say, of course, with Mitoma is he had a great, brilliant start under Roberto De Zerbi. Then actually kind of cooled off as a player a little bit later on in the season. His finishing was actually a little bit too, to be desired, if we're being honest. And actually, the interesting thing is his underlying stat actually continually improved. So the idea is that as Brighton continued to develop as a team, Mitoma actually got into better positions over the course of the year. So I'm actually looking at this as a positive sign instead, even though he struggled with the finishing close to the end. Yes, of course, we've seen poor finishers in FPL, but it doesn't mean that bad options. Jesus is a good example of that. I think Mitoma is going to continue to get into good positions. Yes, McAllister is a huge miss, but we actually got a bit of a glimpse of what this team would look like without McAllister close to the end of the season when he was benched for a couple of games, and Brighton were still showing that they were actually a very comfortably good offense. And yes, of course, Caicedo could leave the team, so that might change things quite dramatically, but you can still think that someone like Gross can actually cover in the midfield position. The question then, of course, is going to be who their fullbacks are, but you're not so concerned with that with the Mitoma. I just think that Roberto Zerbi is very capable of coaching a very top offense, and we saw that even in the Serie A when he had a much weaker squad at his disposal. So I do think Mitoma is a great option, and the reason why I actually prefer him to any other Brighton attacker is the minutes. If you look at the preseason, even the early signs are there that he actually is going to get most minutes in the season. How much competition is he going to get versus, let's say, a Solly March in the right wing position? I think João Pedro, of course, can play on the left, but we can see that he's probably a bit more of a shadow striker or even a striker, and he will drift to the left position, but it doesn't really necessarily mean that Mitoma will be off the field. In fact, maybe you can see some interplay between the two of them, and that could be quite electric. As far as Solly March, I would actually classify him as a fourth option, and I'm using him as a direct comparison to Mitoma because I think the main concern with Solly March isn't really his underlying stats. They're really, really good, and I think they compare very well. The issue for me is just really the minutes for him. I think he'll lose out a bit of minutes due to players like Enciso needing to find more minutes, and even someone like Buonanotte coming back into the team. Even Sarmiento, for example, is coming back as well, which will probably pose some issues for March and his minutes. We also saw him sort of suffer from a little bit less minutes close to the end of the season. He was dealing with an injury. You know, Roberto De Zerbi might actually take it easy with him at the start of the season. So therefore, I just think, why even tempt yourself with someone like March, who could actually have less minutes than Mitoma, and they're comparatively great options as well. As far as the actual third best option in the 6.5 midfielders for Game Week 1, I actually think it's going to be Eze from Crystal Palace. I've discussed already that I think Crystal Palace are going to be a weaker offense than Brentford and Brighton. I think the biggest impact there is going to be the sort of expected goal involvement ceiling that he has. You can see clearly from the expected goal point of view that it's actually really good for Eze. And of course, a full season of penalties should hopefully benefit him a little bit more. You have some very technical players in this team still that could draw penalties. Olise leaving to Chelsea, which apparently is a rumor, could obviously dramatically change things. If he leaves, I do think that this Crystal Palace team would have dropped off a lot in terms of quality. And that's the main concern with Eze, where the overall quality of the squad is a little bit weaker than some of the other top options, particularly when you actually have some other options at your disposal in the future, like an Aston Villa, Newcastle, that we expect to be better offenses. And that's my main concern with Eze. I think his expected goals is good, but then the assists is obviously clearly a little bit lacking. And sometimes you'll also see that Eze isn't someone who gets that involved in the box. That doesn't necessarily mean too much for FPL, but I do think that when you tend to take a lot of touches outside of the box more often as a centre mid sometimes, then that will hamper the way you play. Part of that is going to be influenced by the way that he was utilized by Patrick Vieira. Key thing, of course, is that under Roy Hodgson, he's been a 90 minutes player and, of course, has been bestowed with additional set piece sort of duties. So that's going to be a huge plus for Eze. But I still think the Crystal Palace fixtures are not good enough to really suggest that you should go for Eze over Mbeumo or over Mitoma. The one option that I would say is a clear avoid at this point in time is going to be Pascal Gross. He actually has quite high ownership in FPL, and I think the reason why is because people are seeing that he's got high total points from last season. But I would also say that there's a lot of things that are uncertain with Gross. First of all, in the preseason, we've continued to see him in a fullback position, so that's very, very detrimental to his sort of attacking involvement. He actually has really good expected assists in that position, but when you look at last year and you actually compare, let's say, Mitoma, Gross, and even someone like March, the issue with Gross is that his best numbers were actually under Graham Potter, whereas the other two players are clearly benefiting from the appointment of Roberto De Zerbi. That's one of the issues in terms of how Gross plays for this team. Yes, he could move into the centre midfield position, but they also have Dahoud there, so that would actually mean that he's going to struggle for minutes in the centre mid spot, and you don't really want to gamble where someone's potentially playing at fullback, potentially playing at midfield at times, at this very lucrative position. Another thing too is a lot of people are sort of championing him as a differential because he could be taking on the penalties. The issue that I see is that Roberto De Zerbi has actually not really shown who's going to be the next penalty taker. We've seen that Gross took penalties for Potter, but not under De Zerbi. So far in the preseason, when Gross was off the pitch, we saw João Pedro take a penalty. That's not an early sign to say João Pedro is the absolute nailed-on penalty taker, but keep in mind, of course, that they even got someone like Milner in the team who could easily take on penalties as well if he's going to play sustained minutes for this Brighton team. That's kind of my early concern for now. But I don't think that we can really even be sure of the fact that Gross is on penalty. So there's no real value to him as an early option for FPL for Game Week 1. And I think he's a clear avoid for the season. Another player to avoid is actually going to be Enciso. I think the reason why he's an avoid, unfortunately, is just because with Lallana coming back into the team and João Pedro probably going to take a starting position over him, we're not really going to see many minutes for Enciso. Enciso was actually someone who actually came up into the team due to the abundance of injuries in the second half of the season. He's 19 years old. I do expect him to play quite a few games for Brighton this season, but probably to start the season, I would actually expect something like 1 out of 3 starts, which is not good enough as an FPL asset. And even though he has really good underlying stats, because of the minutes, he's just not really an option. And I've only seen him really being used as an option to sort of plug into some sort of Salah-based draft. For now, unfortunately, he's just not really a pick to think about. As far as players that are worthy of watching, I think actually Barnes, Almiron, and Diaby are all within this sort of class. And the reason why I say this is because these players all have fantastic numbers. Barnes and Almiron are more your goal getters, so they have really good expected goals, very similar to Eze, but a huge drop-off in terms of expected assists compared to some of those prior top options like an Mbeumo and Mitoma. So that's kind of an initial concern there. Even with March, for example, there's a huge drop-off when we look at expected assists. Diaby, however, of course, actually has wonderful stats from both aspects. So his expected goal involvement is incredibly high. We're expecting him to come in for a very, very strong Aston Villa team that have actually seemingly strengthened within this transfer window, right? Some defensive improvements like Pau Torres, but then also, of course, adding a little bit more firepower with Diaby himself. One of my concerns with Diaby, of course, is maybe his minutes. And we should actually use game weeks 1 to 4 to actually really assess between, let's say, Almiron, Barnes, and Diaby, who's actually getting consistent minutes, who's actually most prone to being rotated. Because the issue with Newcastle, I think, is they actually have sort of built upon their depth this season, and you might actually see that someone like Barnes and even Almiron continue to struggle with minutes. That's why Almiron actually became a bit of a worse option last year when Newcastle actually slowly improved as an offense, and someone like Wilson became an electric pick. As far as someone like Diaby, of course, we just need to see whether he deals well with the minutes that might be shared with someone like Leon Bailey. That's something to monitor on. But I do think he's actually had a stellar career within the Bundesliga. Add a little bit of tax in. I understand why people are uncertain, but I do think he's going to be a great pick to think about. At least when you actually go through these game week 1 to 4 fixtures, see how Aston Villa do versus tougher opposition, and then move on to him when they actually have great fixtures. Look at the Newcastle fixtures here and the Aston Villa fixtures here for game week 5 onwards. This is a great price point to actually move into those players, and I think that's the beauty really of starting with 2 6.5 midfielders, and that's actually one of the ideas I have for this video. There's nothing really to say that you only need to pick one of these 6.5 midfielders. If you look at the sort of midfield formation here where you have like someone like Saka, Rashford, and Bruno actually, then maybe you can actually just cheapen down your midfield a little bit by going for these really, really good 6.5 picks. You have these options here who actually have a lot of diversity, so it's very easy to move up and move down, particularly if you have 0.5 in the bank. If you want to move down, you have options like Buendia that could be interesting. He could actually have a good season if Aston Villa continue to build on as a top team. If you look at the 7.0 position, you've got options like Bowen and Sterling that you could move into. Starting with the 7.0 pick doesn't seem so enticing because it's not so easy to move it in those areas. As far as the 6.5, there's so much diversity there, and someone like Mbuma, as I said, has such great fixtures. I don't really even see a reason to really hop off of him. Whereas if you're going for someone like Mitoma, you could simply just move away from him after the first few fixtures for Brighton, and then simply move into someone like Sterling if you actually have 0.5 in the bank, and then sort of look at that as a transfer option, because Chelsea don't really have great fixtures from the attacking point of view game weeks 1 to 2. And that's kind of my thoughts in terms of the position right now for the 6.5 midfielders and why I think it's so interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please also feel free to comment as well. What do you actually think is your ranking of the 6.5 mids? Are you actually looking at some other players to pick into your team? And are there any other players that are actually worth watching out for you?